This man was convicted of murder 3 separate times. And yet, from the very beginning, there was one piece of evidence that should have ended the case: DNA. That science is precise. That science tells truth. But the story that follows is not about science. It is about what happens when a system, pressed by fear, politics, and the need to close a case, chooses its story over the facts. This is the story of Juan Rivera and how a community's demand for certainty turned into a man's 2-decade nightmare. But here's where it gets chilling. The moment you think this case is over, it twists again. And with every twist, the truth gets buried deeper. If you want to follow every turn and uncover more stories the system tried to silence, make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next, you will never forget. It was late August of 1992, warm, humid, the sort of Midwestern evening when people sat on porches with fans humming. In a modest apartment in Waukegan, Illinois, 11-year-old Holly Staker was doing what young teenagers did: babysitting children across the hall. She had been left alone but for a sleeping toddler and the hum of a television. She was trusted. She was careful. She was a kid. That night, someone came into the apartment. He violated her privacy. He raped her. He stabbed her 27 times. He strangled her. The brutality felt primal, astonishing, unforgivable. The children were left alive but traumatized. The neighborhood closed its blinds in the morning. The police sealed the apartment. The county sheriff called it one of the most horrific crimes he had seen. The next days were a blur of crime scene tape, coroner's sheets, and the quiet disbelief of a town that suddenly knew it was not as safe as it felt. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Parents clutched their kids, and anger rose toward the idea that somebody could do something so monstrous in a place so ordinary. In the press, the story became shorthand for every communal fear. Children are vulnerable, predators can be anyone, and the system must act, and quickly, to bring a killer to justice. Police pressure mounted. The mayor asked for arrests. Detectives promised results. Investigators began to canvass, collect tips, and follow leads. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. The mystery deepened. The one piece of physical evidence that mattered, the one piece that could point toward a perpetrator, was biological: semen recovered at the scene. At the time, in the early 1990s, DNA testing was still newer than it is today, but it was already a revolution. The sample was preserved and stored. It would later speak, and what it would say should have been decisive. Juan Rivera was 19. He was a young man from Waukegan who had been in special education and who had had earlier, nonviolent brushes with the law. He was described by people who knew him as vulnerable, sometimes confused, not street-hardened. The facts of his adolescence included school problems and stumbles typical of many young men in struggling neighborhoods. Crucially, Rivera had known police. He had a previous conviction for a burglary and was, at one point, under electronic monitoring out of an ankle bracelet program. That made him visible to investigators. It made him a name in a list. In October and November of 1992, investigators received a tip, a name. Two things often combine to make the worst kind of suspect magnet: contact with police and availability. One had both. Within weeks, he was brought in to be questioned. Imagine a small room, a table, bright, clinical lights, the clock overhead, the one-way window. For 4 days, investigators questioned Juan. For days of near-constant interrogation. No lawyer present. Little sleep. Repetitive, leading questions. The magistrate rooms and interrogation rooms in police stations are a study in extremes. On paper, they are benign. In practice, they are a pressure cooker. Investigators know the playbook: isolate, wear down, suggest, feed phrases, and obtain that all-powerful confession. The Reed technique, the script detectives often follow, is an art of exhaustion. It is built to break resolve. Juan told a version of events to the police, but that version was inconsistent and contradictory. He said things that didn't match the house's layout. He described clothing that the coroner's photo showed wasn't accurate. He got basic chronological details wrong. He described actions that in physics could not be true. Yet the police recorded the statements, and prosecutors later presented them to juries as a confession. When you see a confession on paper, it looks simple and final. A person admits wrongdoing. But confession science, the study of why innocent people sometimes confess, is dark and complicated. We now know that vulnerable people can be steered into saying things they do not truly recall. Sleep deprivation, promises of leniency, appeals to conscience, admonitions of inevitability. These are all part of the coercive environment. Echoes of that environment are unmistakable when you read the original interrogation notes. While Rivera endured the interrogation, technicians in labs were running tests. The samples preserved from Holly Staker's body were subjected to the fledgling brilliance of forensic DNA. It was not perfect in 1992. Technologies improved across the following decade. But a test conducted in 2004 and reported in court filings a few years later showed a profile that did not match Juan. The semen on the victim, the biological signature of the attacker, matched someone else. It excluded Rivera. This is an important technical point to pause on because many people misunderstand what excluded means. In forensic terms, to say a profile excludes a person is to say that the genetic markers do not match. These markers are not subject to interpretation the way a witness memory can be. They are objective. If the profile excludes someone, that person cannot be the source of that semen sample. That should, in any rational system, exonerate them of the charged sexual assault. So the evidence should have said, wrong suspect, case unsolved. But that did not happen. Why? Because the wheels of prosecution had already gripped a narrative. The confession existed, the police had a suspect, and the community had expectations. The prosecution's solution to the DNA problem was not to accept it. It was to explain it away. Prosecutors speculated that the victim might have been sexually active prior to the assault, a suggestion doubly fraught given the victim's age and social context. They also raised the possibility of lab contamination, or that the semen had been deposited by someone else entirely and therefore didn't implicate Rivera. These theories are not, in themselves, impossible, but they are speculative. In the absence of direct evidence corroborating those claims, they are thin veneers over a case that should have been open and shut in the wrong direction. The court files show a stunning fact. When presented with a direct, objective exclusion by DNA, the prosecutors chose to press forward. At trial, jurors heard the recorded confession. They heard detectives testify about the interrogation. They were told that the chain of investigation had led to Rivera and that his admissions had been corroborated in small ways. The defense pointed to the DNA exclusion. They argued to the jury that the statements Juan gave were coerced, that he had been worn down, that details had been fed to him by investigators. Yet the human mind is a story-making machine. In the mind of many jurors, the simple drama of a confession outranked the clinical dryness of DNA reports. A person who says, "I did it," tends to hang on jurors' memories like a vivid stain. Police testimony, vivid and authoritative, often carries more weight than laboratory printouts to people unfamiliar with probabilistic science. And so, in 1993, a jury convicted Juan Rivera of first-degree murder. The sentence was life. It felt final and irreversible. For many in Waukegan, justice had been done. For Juan, the world narrowed to a 4x8 cell and a uniform. For his family, the daily companion of hope became scarcity. After conviction, Rivera's legal team fought on appeal. In 1996, an appellate court did, in fact, reverse the conviction and remand for a new trial, a first crack in the system's armor. The court questioned elements of the admission and raised concerns about the weight given to the confession. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe the system would correct itself. Maybe the DNA would be heard. But this case would prove stubborn. Prosecutors returned to the bench with renewed determination and the same narrative. They argued that the DNA did not disprove guilt. Perhaps the victim had been sexually active, the sample was from someone else, or the lab had been contaminated. The second trial proceeded years later, and again a jury convicted Juan Rivera. Again a life sentence followed. 2 convictions, 2 finished verdicts. But by the time the appeals machinery turned again, the world of forensic genetics had advanced. Further DNA testing in the 2000s provided a profile more precise than what had been available in the immediate aftermath of the crime. The new testing excluded Rivera once more. The laboratory findings showed a genetic profile that was consistent across samples, a profile not belonging to Juan. Pathologically, that should have been a decisive scientific exoneration. Instead, prosecutors persisted. Here's the unthinkable point we must hold in our minds. Objective DNA testing excluded Juan Rivera. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a laboratory result. It should have been a turning point. Instead, it became a fissure. So this is the cliffhanger we leave Act I on. When the DNA says he didn't do it, and the recorded confession says he did, which does the justice system choose? In Waukegan, they chose the confession. They chose a story that could be told simply and loudly, rather than a science that complicated everything. By the time the first jury met in 1993, the prosecution had a narrative polished to a point. Detectives had interviewed the suspect until he talked. He had confessed, and thus he was guilty. Lay jurors were shown interrogations. They heard witnesses, and they were presented a version of events that satisfied narrative coherence. The confession was dramatic. The confession was emotional. The confession was compelling. In that first trial, the defense's central pillars were the confession's weaknesses and the DNA exclusion. The defense attorneys argued that Rivera was a vulnerable young man, placed under extreme psychological pressure, and that investigators had essentially written the story for him. They argued that nothing, no fingerprints, no hairs, no eyewitness placing Rivera at the scene, tied him to the crime physically. That absence should have been redemptive. But criminal trials are human theaters. They are performances that rely on human credulity. When a detective, a seeming authority figure, tells a jury he admitted it, many jurors are inclined to believe it because of the presumed moral authority of the badge. The science became abstract. The confession became the center of gravity. When the verdict came, it was guilty. The life sentence followed. It was a devastating blow, not only for Juan but for anyone who hoped the legal system would be infallible. Rivera's defense team appealed. In 1996, the appellate court issued a published order reversing the conviction, citing procedural errors and ambiguities that warranted a new trial. The victory was narrow but meaningful. The appellate court's opinion included pointed language about the confession's reliability, and many advocates took that decision as a sign that the system could admit error. But the path from reversal to relief is not automatic. Prosecutors, who now had 2 elections worth of pressure and reputations at stake, vowed to retry the case. To them, the idea of walking away, of admitting an error that had such emotional intensity, felt unacceptable. You can read the transcripts of post-conviction hearings and feel the tension. Prosecutors insist on the integrity of their work. Historians of legal ethics wince as they watch the old narratives defend themselves. The second trial, held in 1998, became yet another crucible. In the second trial, prosecutors refined their arguments. They admitted that DNA did not match Rivera, but offered hypotheses. Perhaps the DNA represented consensual sex prior to the crime. Maybe the biological sample was unrelated, or perhaps an accomplice's DNA persisted. Each of these are hypothetical bridges over the gap the science created. But they were, at core, speculation. The defense countered with simpler logic. There was no corroborating evidence tying Rivera to Holly's murder. The DNA that mattered, the semen, did not include nor match Juan. Why would a jury convict on speculation? In 1998, once more, a jury did convict. The verdict returned to life imprisonment. A pattern emerged. Confession guided conviction. DNA complicated it, but did not negate it in the eyes of jurors who had been presented a story of guilt. 2 convictions in, and 2 appeals later, the judicial system showed the first signs of reflexive defense. It would take extraordinary pressure for the next step, national scrutiny. By the time of the third trial, public perceptions of DNA testing had changed. No longer was it a novelty. It had become a robust part of forensic practice. Many exonerations across the country had shown the power of genetic testing to correct miscarriages of justice. And yet, in a twist that many observers call one of the most shocking aspects of this saga, prosecutors again offered a theory designed to neutralize the DNA exclusion. They suggested that the semen found was the result of earlier consensual sex, a theory raised despite the victim being an 11-year-old girl. The argument was grotesque, and in courtroom filings it reads like an attempt to rationalize the irrational. If an 11-year-old had consensual sex, it would be evidence not of exoneration but of another crime. It would dramatically shift the case, but it would not tie Rivera to the murder unless other proof existed. Defense attorneys pointed out the absurdity. They noted that the victim's underwear tested negative for sperm. They noted that the victim's family and friends denied any possibility that the child was sexually active. Yet prosecutors pressed forward. The third trial, held years later, resulted again in conviction. 3 juries, 3 guilty verdicts, 3 life sentences. A surreal, numbing outcome that left many critics aghast and many supporters of prosecutors nodding toward the sanctity of the original investigative narrative. To unpack these repeated convictions, we must step back and understand how institutions react under pressure. Police departments and prosecutors' offices are not impartial laboratories. They are political and cultural institutions. Their aims are not only to find truth, they are also to maintain order, public confidence, and, in some cases, reputations. When an investigation reaches a certain point of public visibility, a child murdered, a community outraged, the cost of admitting error is high. The cognitive impetus to preserve the initial belief, called confirmation bias, becomes institutional. Investigators emphasize supportive evidence, minimize dissent, and reinterpret ambiguous findings in ways favorable to their prevailing theory. In Juan Rivera's case, 3 cycles of trial reinforced a narrative. Each conviction made it easier for the next set of actors, jurors, judges, more prosecutors, to accept the story. To correct that story required not only DNA results, but public energy. False confessions are not a myth. They have been documented in dozens of exoneration cases nationwide. The psychology is complex, high pressure, leading questions, sympathy ploys, exhaustion, fear, and sometimes suggestibility, especially among vulnerable individuals, can produce self-incriminating statements. People confess to avoid immediate pain, to escape interrogation, or because they begin to believe the narrative put before them. That is why many innocence advocates insist on videotaping interrogations, to capture the context in which statements are made. When jurors see a confession on a video or read it in a transcript, they often assume voluntariness and veracity. The dynamics inside an interrogation room, however, include 1,000 small coercions that rarely show on paper. That was true for Juan. The second major turning point in Act 2 comes with the appellate court's grants, a conviction overturned. When the appellate court reverses a conviction, the public tends to interpret that as the system self-correcting. For a moment, that hope was real. Yet the state's decision to retry Rivera, to return to the same theory despite the DNA exclusion, is the crucial, dramatic pivot. That reversal gives the audience the first major pause. The court has said the prior trial was flawed enough to warrant reversal. A naive viewer might expect the prosecution to rethink, but instead the prosecution doubles down, showing the world that this is not an ordinary legal mistake. It is a systemic choice to pursue narrative over objective truth. This is the second cliffhanger you want at the midpoint. The conviction is overturned. Hope is briefly restored, but the state immediately announces it will retry him again and again, using variants of the same flawed theory. The viewer understands the stakes. This is not simple error. It is institutional determination. After the third conviction, there was a cumulative effect. Reporters started digging. The Chicago Tribune and other outlets published pieces that questioned the process and highlighted anomalies. The lack of physical evidence linking Rivera to the scene, the odd contours of the confession, the DNA exclusions, and the withdrawal of potentially critical evidence years earlier, the shoes with blood on them that law enforcement had once possessed, but that were not introduced at trial. A documentary and investigative reports began to connect the dots. Journalists published the messy timeline: confession, conviction, reversal, retry, reconviction, more DNA testing, and eventual linkage of the crime scene DNA to other cases. As the national press shone light, public sentiment shifted. The arc of outrage grew. People began to ask how 3 juries had convicted a man when science contradicted the narrative. They wanted to know who else had been imprisoned because the system was too invested to admit error. As the case drew national attention, the Innocence Project, Northwestern's legal clinic, and pro bono attorneys joined Rivera's defense. Their strategy was methodical and simple. Use the best available science to test and retest biological evidence. Attack the legal and investigatory procedures that produced the confession, and show, in a court of law and in public opinion, that the state's case was unsustainable. By 2004 to 2005, New DNA testing technologies generated more reliable, robust profiles. Tests confirmed what earlier tests suggested. The semen did not come from Juan Rivera. The profile produced a partial match, set the lab to look for cross-reference hits. Later, DNA on a pair of shoes the prosecution had earlier attempted to use as evidence, but then withdrew before trial, added an unsettling twist. Modern testing showed the victim's blood on the shoes and also revealed a genetic profile matching the semen sample. The implication was chilling. The shoe evidence that might have helped the defense had been handled in a way that made it unavailable, and the evidence, when tested years later, linked a different profile to a different crime scene. These revelations were not only scientific, they were procedural, showing how evidence had been managed, what had been withheld, and what adjustments could have fundamentally changed a trial. In December 2011, after years of litigation and renewed testing, the Illinois Appellate Court reversed the conviction for a final time. The court found that the confession had little probative force given how it was obtained and how its content reflected material already known to investigators. The DNA evidence had excluded Rivera and linked the crime to an unknown male profile. The court concluded that the evidence presented at trial was insufficient to sustain a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. On January 6, 2012, Juan Rivera walked out of prison a free man after nearly 2 decades behind bars. The exoneration was a dizzying mixture of joy, anger, and hollow victory. For Rivera, the release meant walking into sunlight after living in institutional darkness for 20 years. It meant reunions with family that were years late. It meant a life no outgoing prisoner could fully reclaim. When a wrongfully convicted person regains freedom, the challenges begin at the gate. There is no course to make up lost years. There is no real reparations that return a father's missed birthdays. No formal lesson plan to replace a high school education lost to a cell. No therapy program that fully heals institutional trauma. Juan Rivera received community support, pro bono legal help, and the attention of advocacy groups. Yet the private costs were incalculable. Relationships strained by absence. Children who would know a father only by memory and photographs. The alienation of a world that evolved without them. Anyone who imagines exoneration as a return to normality is wrong. Exoneration is a beginning, not a restoration. In 2015, Lake County agreed to pay a $20 million settlement to Rivera, one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in U.S. history at that time. The sum acknowledged, in part, the profound injustice, the failure of institutions, and the real, tangible damage done to a human life. The settlement included money from municipalities, officials, and even private entities that had played a role, directly or indirectly, in the conviction. To many observers, the settlement represented both accountability and closure. But to Rivera and his family, it delivered mixed emotions. Money does not rewrite the record of lost time, nor does it restore trust in institutions that had once promised protection and instead inflicted harm. Perhaps the most painful element of this entire story is that, even after Juan's release and the court's recognition of the case's defects, the person who killed Holly Staker has not been definitively convicted. Modern DNA techniques have produced a profile that investigators have been able to link to other crime scenes, but not yet to a living suspect who could be tried. The knowledge that the real perpetrator may still walk free sits like a stone in the shoe of the community. For the victim's family, exoneration of one man does not tidy the grief. They will always have the question, who did this to Holly? Investigators have followed leads. Laboratory cross-checks identified a profile with hits in other crime locations and circumstances. Some of those cross cases involve troubling parallel narratives, similar features of sexual assault and extreme violence. But connecting DNA to an identified suspect is its own battleship of process. There are privacy limitations, lab backlogs, and the sheer practical chaos of decades-old investigations. For the family, the truth is a double-edged sword. They know their community's justice system failed a man and failed their child. Holding both ideas at once, that someone innocent was punished and the real killer remains unknown, is a psychological and moral tightrope. One positive outcome from cases like Juan Rivera's is structural reform. His case, and dozens like it, pushed states and municipalities to re-examine interrogation practices, to mandate videotaping of custodial interviews in homicide cases, and to require more rigorous chain of custody documentation for evidence. It also sharpened prosecutorial ethics debates. How aggressively should prosecutors use theories of contamination or prior consensual sexual contact when a victim is a minor? How should prosecutors behave when objective scientific evidence contradicts their narrative? As policy debates swirled, public defenders and innocence advocates used Rivera's case as proof that reforms are not merely legal abstractions, but human necessities. Videotaped interrogations reduce ambiguity. Transparent evidence logs prevent the kind of shoe-tracking problems that complicated Rivera's defense. And stronger standards for expert testimony aim to keep junk science out of courtrooms. There is no single fix. Training police, auditing labs, improving defense resources, and reforming prosecutorial incentives all matter. Rivera's case is both a cautionary tale and a push toward incremental institutional improvements. Even as reforms are implemented, the scars remain. Juan Rivera's face in interviews bears a quiet gravity that money and apology cannot erase. He is a different man than the 19-year-old who walked into an interrogation room. There are days when trauma revisits him as nightmares. Days when he struggles to navigate a world with mobile apps and technology he missed, and days when the simplest acts of domestic life can feel strange. Friends who once were near feel distant. There are lingering injuries to mental health, to trust, and to identity. Rivera's exoneration does not erase his loss, it only reframes it. He is free, but the freedom is with a past that cannot be returned. The final moment in our story is a bittersweet one. Juan Rivera's exoneration did force accountability and change. It contributed to a public conversation about false confessions, about the seductive power of an easy narrative, and about how science must be allowed to speak. But the larger revelation is that systems change slowly, often in incomplete ways. There is still work to be done. More transparency, more oversight, and more humility from powerful institutions that can, in a blink, upend a life. And the most haunting truth remains. The person who took Holly Staker from her family has not been conclusively brought to justice. That unsolved question is a moral wound that continues to fester. It reminds us that justice sometimes fails twice. First, when it convicts the wrong person, and second, when it leaves the real perpetrator unknown and unpunished. Juan Rivera's case forces us to ask simple, devastating questions. Who will we trust? Hard science or compelling story? How will institutions balance the pressure to close cases with the humility to accept fallibility? How do we rebuild a life when no apology is deep enough? This is the story of an innocent man imprisoned 3 times. It is not a story that ends in tidy justice. It is a story that ends in vigil, the vigilance of journalists, the work of scientists, the determination of lawyers, and the steady demand by citizens that the word justice means something more than a conviction. As you sit with this story, ask yourself, are we the kind of society that allows certainty to trump truth? If not, what will you do to make sure our systems do better tomorrow than they did yesterday? Because that, finally, is how change begins. Not with verdicts alone, but with recognition, reform, and an insistence that the science we build and the processes we design must serve human dignity first.